Well, I've lost count over how long it's been. I stopped stressing over that about a week ago. I only know it's been well over a month. So, welcome back. Thank you for returning back and not giving up on me. It's another edition of Nothing But the Truth, and it's kind of a weird day. I'll get into that later. Let's get going. I'm going to talk more about homicide, what it was like to be a homicide investigator, and what life is like after being a homicide investigator. Don't go away. It's Nothing But the Truth. Welcome back for another episode with me, your host, Ramesh Nyberg, a retired homicide investigator, police officer for 27 years here in South Florida. And I live to tell about it, and I live to tell you about those who didn't live to tell about it. So let's go. Thanks for being here. It's a rather crazy morning. My wife and I were getting ready to leave. We should be flying at this very moment, heading for Las Vegas for a 4-day vacation. And lo and behold, we woke up this morning and they had canceled our flight because of all the storms that happened down in Texas. And, that whole southwestern area got beat up really bad with tornadoes and whatnot. So they canceled our flight. We've been scurrying around all morning, changing everything, changing the flights and the rental cars and all that other stuff. We finally got that all settled. And, I thought, well, I've got a couple extra hours to spare now. Let me knock this out because I've been threatening to do so for the last 3 weeks and have not. So I appreciate you coming back and listening. And a good warm welcome to all of my Coral Reef students. I hope you're listening. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys next Monday, but I won't think about you for the next few days. Don't be offended. Well, it's been a crazy time, March Madness, and I'm not even a basketball fan. Since we last talked, crazy Mr. Putin has launched this savage and horrible war on the Ukraine. Ketanji Brown Jackson has been nominated to the Supreme Court, and as I speak, she's speaking to the Senate for her confirmation hearing. And I mentioned her because she's a Miami girl, and she hails from my alma mater, Miami Palmetto Senior High School. So it's always nice to see a Palmetto grad do something great, like go into space. I think we had one astronaut, and now we have a Supreme Court justice to be. Well, I wanted to talk about what life was like when I first got to homicide and why that's important and how that can kind of reflect back on childhood and how things reflect back on childhood and then back into adulthood. So if that sounds confusing, then you need to read my book, which is going to come out, I hope, by early January of 2023. My next book is called Badge, Tie, and Gun, and The Miami Kid Who Wore All Three. It's a memoir about my life and about my childhood, about growing up in Miami, about becoming a police officer in Miami, and kind of some of the ironies and some of the replicated experiences that I had as a child that formulated or at least affected things that were happening to me as an adult. And I hope it resonates with people in the same way it resonated with me. I didn't plan to write it that way. I just planned to write a memoir. And in the beginning of the book, I had a flashback. So I wrote the flashback. And then as I started thinking about other chapters I wanted to write, I went, hey, this flashback thing is making sense. It's things that happened to me and things that I did as a child and things that my parents told me that kind of emerged again in my adult life, in my police life. And I thought, this is kind of a unexpected discovery. So that kind of forms the fabric of the book itself. So without going into that too much, just I'll keep reminding you as it's getting closer to publication, and it will probably be an e-publication as my first book was. So one of the things that was significant and that I wrote about in the book was my very first job. And my very first job was, I was only about 8 years old, and a good friend of our family, his name was Al Pither. He was as much like an uncle to me, or sometimes like a dad to me. as anyone else in my life. And we were always at their house, and we were very, very close. My parents were very close with Al and his wife. And Al took me to Dolphin games, and he was a big football fan, and that's really what started my love of football as well. Al ran an insurance company in Coral Gables called Southeastern Surplus Lines. It was up on the north end of Ponce de Leon Boulevard. No longer there, long since gone. And he hired me as a page boy. So I don't think they exist anymore because of electronics. And what a page boy did, for those of you who never heard that term, was basically run errands and run messages up and down, back and forth across from Mr. So-and-so to Mrs. So-and-so, and paperwork and memos. And, these were the days with no email and no texting. So if someone wanted to send a message to another worker up in the second floor, you called the page boy over and he ran it upstairs. And so I wore a tie and I was expected to come to work on time. Of course, my parents were dropping me off. And Al was great. He had kind of this dry sense of humor with me at work, where it was only half joking when he expected me to be on time. And the first time I was late to work, I think I was late 15 minutes to work. I had to be there at like 8:30 or something like that. And he docked my pay. Now, he was paying me, I forget what he was paying me. He was paying me $2 or $3 or $4 a day or something. We're talking about 1966, 1967 is when I had this job, but it was my first job. And Al wanted me to take it seriously and to be on time. And so he docked my pay. I think he calculated it to, 39 cents or something. And he wrote out a memo. He had his secretary type a memo, a very serious sounding memo that Mr. Nyberg, you were late and your pay has been docked 37 cents. I expect this won't happen again in the future. Please be more responsible, et cetera, et cetera. Myself and my parents would read this and we'd get kind of a chuckle out of it because we knew him. We partied at his house. I went to football games with him. But at the same time, it instilled something in me that to this day, at the age of 64, is very much a part of my personal etiquette. And that is, don't be late. Don't keep others waiting. My wife will tell you that I stress over it maybe sometimes more than I should. I don't think I've ever been late for an interview or an appointment that was important or a court date. If anything, I would be ridiculously early and sit in a parking lot or whatever and wait, but I would never, ever think of walking in 5 minutes late or 2 minutes late to an appointment. And so this kind of obsession with time and the clock has served me well in many ways. I've had people remark to me in various settings, whether social or business settings, "Oh, wow, you're here on time. How could you not be on time? How can people not be on time for things? If you tell me 7:15, I'm probably going to be in your lobby at 7:10 or 7 o'clock waiting for you to call me in." So, and then that's something I instilled in my kids as well, was just this thing of, it's rude to be late. Now, I live in Miami, and anybody in Miami will tell you we have this thing called Miami time. And some people will call it Cuban time. No offense to the Cubans, but the Cubans themselves call it Cuban time. And that is, 7 o'clock means 7:30 is perfectly fine and 7:45 is acceptable. And if you stroll in at 8, it's okay, we'll make fun and whatever. But that's Miami time. And I've never been a fan of it, but I've learned also to kind of calm down with things too, and in social settings anyway. But if there's a business thing going on, I'm going to be on time. That's just the way I am. And it all started back on that little insurance company on Ponce de Leon Boulevard with Al Pither. When I became a police officer, we had a thing called roll call. And roll call was the little meeting with your supervisor that occurred every morning or every afternoon, depending on what hours you were working, before you went out on the road in uniform or before you started your day as a detective. And by God, you better be on time for roll call, or others will take notice and they would make fun of you and humiliate you. Now, in homicide, you did not walk in to roll call late. You were going to get torn to shreds. And I've seen guys literally turn around and walk back down the hall when they saw that roll call was already in progress. It's better to be half an hour late and miss roll call than to walk in when roll call was going on, because our commander, who was a captain at the time, would look at you and say, "Oh, Nyberg's here. We can start the meeting now." And there would be some chuckles, but he wouldn't be chuckling. So my obsession with being on time turned out to be a good thing for me. It was part of our work ethic in Homicide. We definitely had a work culture that I guess translated into a mystique for other parts of the police department. The uniformed people or people in other investigative units would look at Homicide and they'd go, "Wow, Homicide was like this kind of mystical place that that had its own kind of pantheon where people acted differently, and we were the only ones that wore ties." And I think they probably thought we were arrogant and we were elite, and some of us were. But let's face it, we had a job that was quite different and had many more and unique demands than most jobs in the police department had. So in that sense, we kind of were different, and there was a mystique. And when the first time you went there, it was somewhat intimidating. Now, I showed up in the homicide office as a brand new detective on January 28th, 1985. I had been a uniformed police officer for 6.5 years. I'd gotten commendations from my uniformed supervisors for how well I wrote reports. So I know how to write reports. And in Homicide, they said, "Hey, we write a lot of reports in here. They're long. You're not going to handwrite them. You're going to dictate them onto a tape machine." And we did. We sat there with cassette recorders and dictated our reports onto cassette tape, which in turn was given to the stenographers. And we walked them over to the steno's office. We didn't have any page boys. And they typed them up. So here I was like, "Hey, man, this report thing, I've got this down." Well, they had a whole different way of structuring report writing in Homicide. And what I thought was a good report was nowhere near a good report. So I learned all over again, and I learned a new level of humility when I stepped into that Homicide office, as most new detectives do. We had about 55 detectives when I first started in 1985, predominantly males. I mean, almost all men. I think we had one female come in later, and then over the course of the years, 2 or 3 other females. And it's not that females were not wanted there. I think there's not many females actually applied for the job, but the ones we did have were fantastic, and everybody worked together. But we definitely had rites of passage. So when you were a new detective, you were kind of under the magnifying glass, as it were, in the fishbowl, and everybody was expecting you to do whatever was asked of you. And usually what that meant was decompose bodies. They went to the new detective, okay, the FNG, the fucking new guy. Decomposed body, give it to the FNG, the rookie member of the squad. And you handled all those for several months until they could see and observe your behavior and the way you conducted yourself around your peers, and how willing you were to work extra hours and do whatever it took to be a part of the team. That was really big. There were no individuals in Homicide. You didn't go off and do things on your own or be a loner. You weren't going to make it. You would be ostracized and you would be out of there. So whatever it took. And as a result of that culture, we got very, very close with each other. You worked with 4 or 5 detectives on a squad, and that might include your supervisor, your sergeant. And you met every morning. And, of course, there was roll call, which was the entire unit would be there, the day shift, in which the detectives would brief everyone on the previous day's activity. So if someone had a homicide the day before, they would spend a minute or two talking about it. So everybody was aware of what everyone was working in case any mutual witnesses, suspects, etc. might come up. And so everybody learned to communicate. If you were not a good communicator, again, that was going to work against you in Homicide. The work was considered to be something we took great pride in. You didn't cut corners in Homicide. You didn't solve homicides by sitting at your desk. You were expected to go out and make contacts in the community. We had a wooden sign above our entrance that said Goyakod, Goyakod. And what that meant was get off your ass and knock on doors. And that was our philosophy. That was our daily mantra. You didn't call people on the phone and say, hey, this is Detective Nyberg. I was wondering if you saw what happened on your block. No, you got in your car and you drove over there and you knocked on the door. You knocked on all the doors in the neighborhood. That was called an area canvass. So that was done as soon as possible after a homicide case. If there wasn't somebody home, you left a card and you came back later. And if there was still nobody home, you came back when you thought they might be home and exhausted all means to make sure you spoke with everyone in that neighborhood. These were old principles that were tried and true principles, and that's why we stuck to them. There were generally two types of homicides that would come in, and that would be what we would call a open pending, or the nickname for that was a whodunit, meaning we've got ourselves a homicide victim and we're not sure who the killer is, or we still have to do some work to confirm who we think the killer might be. And so those are whodunits. And the other one was a CBA, or closed by arrest. We would get to the scene and uniform would already have the person in custody. And so the rest of it was just mop-up work and interviewing witnesses and making sure everything was sealed up tight so that we could package it up nicely and had decent probable cause that we could hand over to the state attorney's office, which was the prosecutor's office. So they could start working on filing the case and start to strategize about how we were going to get a conviction out of the investigation. The open pendings were something that you didn't handle right away. In fact, when you were a new detective, the first thing you handled was suicides and accidental deaths and natural deaths. And those came in a steady flow. You may not read about a lot of that in the paper, but homicide detectives handle those all the time. And that's what you cut your teeth on, was learning how to work those first. And once your supervisor, your training detective, whoever was mentoring you on that squad, it was usually, a senior guy on the squad mentoring you. Once they saw that you could do those things and do them with a certain amount of competence that was going forward, you're going to become better at things, then you might be ready for your first homicide. And generally your first homicide was going to be a CBA. All right, learn how to do the whole thing and manage the entire case, be the lead investigator on that case, and direct other detectives to do leads and manage the case file and put it all together the way we did it. And there was a certain format for putting together the files and the photographs and the reports. A homicide case file was no small job. Several people involved, crime scene investigators, what we call crime scene techs, that would take the photographs and do the processing of the scene, the lab analysis reports that would come back from the lab on evidence, fingerprints, blood, ballistics, whatever it might be. So once you got competent at that, then you were ready for your first open pending or whodunit case. My first one scared me just a little bit. We were without any real solid information on the killers for a good 3 weeks before we got a big break. And I think I've already talked about that case here. So before I make a fool of myself and go into that case, maybe we'll just leave that one for the next episode. So I just wanted to give you an overview of what the culture was like in homicide. It was an exciting place to work. It was a place where you went to work every day and never really knew what was going to happen, what was going to come in. You might have plans. You might have made plans to interview witness A and witness B, and you got a deposition scheduled at 2:00 in the afternoon. That could all change in the blink of an eye. A big case might come in where your squad was needed to help, or 2 or 3 homicides might come in and all of a sudden your team is back up again. We worked on a rotation basis, so you just never knew what was going to happen. One day I came to work and learned that we were going to be working on the Miami River Cops case, or the Tamiami Strangler, which was a serial killer we had here in Miami. So you just better be prepared. You better be ready. And of course, 1 week out of every month on the day shift, your squad would be designated as the on-call squad. So, you slept with your notepad and a pen next to your bed and expected fully to get called out at 2, 3 in the morning, whatever it might be. I learned to be adaptable. But again, I hearken back to my days on the water sailing with my dad. And my dad always taught me, you have to learn to watch the weather and be ready for changes in the weather at any time. The weather can change violently, quickly, and you need to know how quickly to take down the sails, which sails to take down, how to point the bow into the wind, all these different things, and change up and be adaptable. And I learned those things as a kid, and I don't think my dad was really even aware that he was teaching me life lessons would emerge and be illuminated by my work as a homicide investigator. Take note of the things you did when you were young. They stick with you. They come back to you. They reemerge in different form as you get older. Thanks for being with me. I appreciate it. I will see you next time. Don't forget, always put your best foot forward, but don't forget to work on your other foot. See you guys.